All right, for those of you who have just joined, please feel free to introduce yourself using the chat box. And I'm just going to get started with a couple of housekeeping items. So we do ask that you leave your microphone and your video off while the speakers are presenting. There will be time to turn it on during the Q&A period. If you have any technical issues during this call, please reach out to my colleague Caroline and she can help you troubleshoot. If we all have technical issues and the Zoom video stops working, we can switch to the conference phone line. And the conference phone line is here on the screen. It should also be in your emails. And we will send an email to everyone registered if we do end up having to switch to the phone. But so far, we haven't had any issues with the technology. And just a reminder that we do record each of these webinars. So all previous recordings from our past 7 weeks or so are available on our website at cfleads.org under the resources section. And just a reminder, you probably saw in your emails, we are going to be switching to a bi-weekly schedule after this week. So we'll have a reminder at the end. But thank you so much for continuing to join us and for your ongoing participation in these weekly webinars. I'll turn it over to Deborah now to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you, Melody. And thanks to all of you for participating in another one of our webinars in our Community Connections in Times of Crisis webinar series. As those of you who've participated in the past know, this is an online forum for community foundations who want to come together. And here are your community foundation colleagues are navigating the consequences of the coronavirus. Because this disaster has hit all of us, and we are all positioned to play leadership roles in our communities, we have a lot to learn from one another. And we've just observed this as being a remarkable time of solidarity for the field. So it's been another week of new cases for the virus and more deaths and obviously continued economic crisis. And some experts are even pointing out that once the data from New York are removed from the national data, it actually may be a bit of a worse situation from the rest of the country than we realize, because New York's flattening the curve and kind of hiding the growth of cases elsewhere. In any case, in many places, we are still very much in the thick of the public health challenge. But at the same time, of course, we are all eager to get our economy moving again. And public officials, of course, across the country are exploring how to do this while still protecting the health of the community. So we're all starting to look beyond the crisis and eager to do so. In fact, I'm hearing from many community foundations that are now beginning to lift their heads towards longer-term rebuilding. And they're really trying to examining where to go next. You're beginning to have conversations with other funders, with public sector leaders and leading nonprofits to think through what a recovery might actually look like. And that's not easy, but as you'll hear from our speakers today, you have an important role to play. As community foundations, you are positioned to bring a broad community perspective to the table, which of course is informed by your relationships with nonprofits, community residents, donors, and other community leaders. You are independent institutions, which really allows you to kind of ask those questions that help everyone understand the full context of the realities of your community, and actually really helps us all to be able to listen. You, of course, also have considerable power due to your financial resources and personal connections. So when you speak, people listen. So in these times when the most vulnerable among us have been devastated, using your voice to lift up those who have not been heard in the past is uniquely valuable. And you are able to take the long view, particularly if you have a significant endowment. You can push the conversation about creating a better tomorrow, even though things today are pretty rough, because you're going to be in your community for good forever. This work is invigorating and tiring. It's inspiring and disheartening, and it's confusing as well as really clarifying. But this is important work, and we need community foundations. We really need you. So as those of you who have participated know, at each of our Community Connections webinars, we'll hear from colleagues across the country, from community foundations and experts that are of all parts of all regions of the country. It's large, small, some who had experienced the pandemic very early, some who are just seeing it now. We'll then facilitate a conversation. After we hear from these two folks, we'll facilitate conversations and questions. And probably the easiest thing to do is to type your questions into the chat box. Then I'll call on you and you can state your question on audio if you're willing, and also you can show yourself on video so that we continue to build this as a community. So we're really lucky today to have two really terrific speakers who have real experience with a lot of crisis. And we thought that would be really helpful to you to hear from folks who have been through this before and been through crises that have been pretty long and extensive. So first we're going to hear from Flozell Daniels, who's the president and CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana, which is formerly the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Fund. He's been at the foundation for 12 years and is a public policy and community engagement strategist with expertise in community development, resilience building, legislative strategy, and leadership development. Prior to his appointment at the foundation, Flozell served as Tulane University's assistant vice president and director of state and local affairs for 9 years. And prior to that, he was an urban policy specialist and administrative assistant in the mayor's office in the city of New Orleans. The Foundation for Louisiana is part of the CF Leads Economic Mobility Action Network, which is funded by the Gates Foundation with additional support from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. Tony Pipa is Senior Fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, where he studies place-based policies to improve social progress in the United States and globally, including through the use of Sustainable Development Goals, or what we know as SDGs. During the Obama administration, he served as Chief Strategy Officer at USAID and held multiple senior positions in the agency. Tony has 25 years of executive experience in the philanthropic and public sectors, addressing poverty and advancing inclusive economic development. He actually helped launch the Foundation for Louisiana in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and played a principal role in the startup of several philanthropic adventures focused on addressing poverty and improving distressed communities. So with those full introductions, I'll turn it over to you, Flozell. You can put yourself on video and take off your mute.
Fantastic. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. To everyone, thanks for having me, Deborah. It's really great to be here with the CF Leads team and all of these amazing leaders from across community foundations here in the country, as well as my good friend, Tony Pipa. As Deborah mentioned, the Foundation for Louisiana got its start in foundation. We were founded 6 days after Hurricane Katrina hit the shores of Louisiana, and we were fortunate in the sense that the founders, amazing leaders in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector and the private sector, really understood that there was an opportunity for us to not only mount a disaster recovery process that would serve people well, but that we would get a chance to do it through a lens of deep equity and inclusion. This was really an opportunity for philanthropy to do something different in the context of the Katrina recovery. And so nearly 15 years later, we've had the privilege of doing that work, learning a lot of lessons. Deborah mentioned the disasters and the different ways that this has shown up, at least in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. Just a reminder for folks, in addition to the cataclysm of Hurricane Katrina and Rita that came just a few weeks later in another part of the state, we also endured major storms of Gustav and Ike, the BP oil disaster. We actually consider the 08-09 economic downturn as a sort of another wave that came through our community. And of course, now we are dealing with COVID-19 and just sort of ravaging our communities, and really philanthropy is stepping up in ways that I've never seen before to be creative. Um, I'll talk about a couple of lessons that we've learned over the years that we believe come out of the Katrina landscape, but in fact have been sharpened by every disaster. And we also talk a lot about building resilience in and out of disaster time, which is, I think, a major theme for all of us to consider. And unfortunately, we should always be thinking about building strength and resilience with ourselves and in our partners so that we're even stronger the next time something comes around. So, first things first, equity is your answer, no matter the question. We really believe this. It was our original thesis, and we have found it to be an enduring truth, right? We knew out the gate that both data and history and experience around racial, gender, and neighborhood inequities stood as guideposts to the strategies that would improve the kind of universal measures of well-being that I believe most of us work on, right? We looked at safety, economic security, access to democracy, social cohesion, family connectedness, health outcomes, all of these things that really go to living well. And we have different ways of defining those things in different parts of community. It really was an important values-based decision point by leaders in the field like Ambassador James Joseph and Lynetta Gilbert, folks who came out of and who had experience in the community foundation world and brought that experience to Foundation for Louisiana, or at the time the Disaster Recovery Foundation, as a way of thinking about how do we hit the streets, so to speak, with the right agenda. One of the examples I'll give of something that we did in that vein was to develop the Equity and Inclusion Campaign. It won't surprise you that in the days, weeks, and months after Katrina, people were skirmishing to figure out how do we impact the decisions that are being made in Washington, D.C., in the state capitol, and across the different states. So we partnered with a group of community leaders in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama to create a federal messaging and policy campaign around some of the critical issues of the day: housing, education, economic opportunity, and really built power by investing in our capacity to help develop leadership development across those states and in those communities, so that people could take their experience, they could understand and better understand policy work, and be given the financial and technical resources to engage in that policy work, so that as they were rebuilding their homes and their lives, they were also engaging in at scale systems change work that would allow them to better impact decisions that would impact them for years to come. I'll come back to the E&I campaign, the Equity and Inclusion Campaign, in a minute. The other thing that we learned in the context of equity and why it was so important is that data analysis and evaluation obviously always plays a critical role in the way we do our work in philanthropy. We wanted to make sure that we developed a shared discipline for community philanthropy to use data and analysis. And so we elevated our regional data center by developing enough grant resources to ensure that they could do the long-term data tracking, but also develop data-driven frameworks for at-scale success. This is how we would measure ourselves. And so ultimately, they developed a set of agreed-upon disaster recovery benchmarks. It won't surprise you that we were looking at things like how many units of housing would be recovered over a year, how many people would move back to the city, or population growth. We were looking at voter participation as a way of testing democratic strength, even using who was using their post office boxes or was getting mail delivered as a way of understanding what was happening at the population level. And we collectively used those benchmarks to track our progress. And it's interesting because over the years, those initial investments in data infrastructure and having a strong enough organization, a set of organizations who could help us with that work, has really been what's made the difference for us from one disaster to the next, it won't surprise you that in this moment, this extraordinary uncertainty of COVID-19, which in some ways reminds us of the VPL disaster in the sense of its uncertainty, the data center was the first one out the gate to establish known and trusted data sets, as well as beginning to develop a policy analysis that has been useful for those of us who are funders, members of community writ large, and certainly the public and private sector who are major actors, as you can imagine, in the way Louisiana is mounting its response to COVID-19. The last thing I'll mention on that front is this idea of experiential sourcing. It's been critical for us to take data and analysis and all of the experts who do that work that we partner with and who we have on staff, and to match that with community experience. It's a critical way to translate how data is actually impacting people and whether our strategies have the intended impact. That's why we consider the source and go directly to our nonprofit and grantee partners, our grassroots community leaders, faith leaders, and others to really understand directly how people are impacted. In the case of COVID-19, of course, we've been challenged to address very quickly what it means for people to just survive this moment. And then for us to mount where we typically stand, which is mid to long-term disaster recovery and resilience building through the pandemic. And going to community allows us to ground truth our analysis and strategy work with the people whose lives we're trying to improve. I'll give you a quick example of that. We, a few years ago, had a chance through some funding partnerships to help a local cultural group called the Mardi Gras Indians to do some grant making to them and to develop a project. And we thought we had a great idea. We were going to make some grants and they were going to do some online technology projects. And in working directly with the Indians themselves and the culture bearers and people from the neighborhood where they practice their culture and live, they actually decided they would prefer to create a campus and to purchase land and property and develop a strategy that would really help them sustain their work. It is not an idea that we had anywhere in our wheelhouse of thinking. And that was about 7 years ago. I'm pleased to announce that as of a couple of months ago, we cut the ribbon on their campus that they own outright. We were able to develop both grant and PRI resources to support that work. And it was just a great example for us of how we learn from the people with whom we get the privilege of working to improve our work. The second bucket of sort of lessons that we learn is the importance of community leadership. And that is just connecting with those closest to the challenge or opportunity, as I was sort of talking about by way of experiential sourcing. This was a major thesis of our creation and our founding, is really understanding how we get to work closest with people to really understand what's going on and to challenge us to improve our work and to find ways for us to show up for each other. The expression of that work for us mostly is wrapped around an initiative that we call LEAD, right? It's a way for us to shift our power dynamic. So we engage people from grassroots communities to policy leaders, members of the public sector, people who are in charge of making important decisions, and others. And they come into a cohort around a certain issue. Affordable housing. In the past, it's been cultural preservation, different and important things like that. And they not only develop a cohort and learn together, but they actually develop a project that they work on together. And then we design grant making to them directly so that they have control over those dollars. They really move the process through. It's both a learning opportunity. It's a way to create networks of people who typically have not been networked before in a more durable way. And it's a way for us to make more enduring grant making that really does address a particular need while teaching, if you will, both philanthropy us at the foundation, and community about what real community leadership partnerships look like. The other thing that we've learned and continue to practice and are trying to improve all the time is this idea of using the breadth and depth of our institutional positioning to be both funder and partner in community and our systems change work. This shows up a lot where our nonprofit partners, our community partners, the public sector and others will say, listen, we're trying to do this work. It's really hard. In the case of COVID-19, trying to make these pivots and trying to understand and address what's happening. And we need your grant dollars, but we also need your partnership. We need you to help us get access to decision makers. We need you to marshal the other resources of philanthropy so that we get beyond just transactional, transactional leadership. And that has been really meaningful. One of my favorite examples, a few years ago in 2017, we did a round of criminal justice reform work here in Louisiana, a justice reinvestment, using the Justice Reinvestment Act. And the governor was going to push that work through, and a bunch of nonprofit organizations and community activists who'd been working on that work for years called on philanthropy to help develop strategies that would work. And we did a couple of things. We not only pulled about 18 funders from the region together and went to meet with the governor and talk about the priorities that community activists and nonprofits had around these issues, but we also developed a surge grant initiative where we were able to move resources within 10 days to a network of nonprofits who would then take on the work of educating the public and creating narratives and developing policy work. While serving, I served on this task force as CEO of the foundation as an inside strategy to really move the work and to build a bridge between what was happening on the outside and what was happening on the inside. We know that the community leadership approach that community foundations take and the need for us to always strengthen that work is critical because of what we learned from Katrina. Tony will remember this. We were taught that this was generational work. It would take 20 years for us to do the work that we needed to do. It is also intersectional work. If you're working in affordable housing, you also have to be working in public education. All of these things impact each other. And because in Louisiana, all of these things are rife with what we sort of call pre-existing conditions of race and gender bias. And so it requires long-term actors who understand the history, who are endowed with experience and are consistently networked through their relationships to create greater outcomes over time. You all will recall my mentioning of the Equity and Inclusion Campaign. It was an important moment in our learning as a philanthropic organization, because when the BP oil disaster happened, and it was a tragic moment, one of the things that we quickly learned from the White House all the way down to grassroots communities was that the leaders who came out of the investments in the Equity and Inclusion Campaign, the folks who had minted their leadership in post-Katrina Gulf Coast leadership, are the same people who mounted leadership strategies to address the BP oil disaster, to protect their communities, to look at both immediate response as well as long-term recovery approaches. And we saw that investment really show up time and time again. And later, if we have time, I can talk more about what that's looking like by way of our coastal resilience strategy as well as COVID-19. And the last thing I'll mention is we talk about putting your oxygen mask on first, both after Katrina and in this moment as we're dealing with COVID-19 and the tragedy of it. We believe deeply from experience that you need to support for teams both internally and for grantees externally to access, obviously, mental health services, this idea of normalizing emotional well-being as a strategy, acknowledging and adjusting for racial healing strategies particularly those that address the added stress of racialized societal responses on both your team members and partners. And we can talk more about what that looks like and how that shows up both as an internal and external strategy. And in that context, you really have to create institutional ways to support rest, which we think is the equal and powerful other half of hard work and excellence, which is always expected. Deep equity work and great philanthropic strategy, as it turns out, and many of you know, will cost emotional and sometimes physical labor. It is incumbent upon us, we think, especially in this moment, with a slow rolling disaster like COVID-19, the emotional strife of the uncertainty of it, it really is incumbent upon us to model this behavior of rest and self-care and putting our oxygen mask on, so that we can develop strategies that not only socialize it, but create opportunities for the work to be better over the long term. As many of our folk have been putting it, we're going to be inside of this particular disaster and tragedy for a long time, and we should take care of ourselves as we go along so that we can be better. One of the things that we've developed and will continue to practice in that context is we have something called the Louisiana Organizers Renewal Awards. It was something that came out of Katrina, to be honest with you all. We saw, it didn't take 6 months to a year before we saw leadership starting to burn out. People were just on the ground in the work, 12, 14-hour days. They were taking care of their families. They were trying to do the amazing work that they were doing, and they were burning out very quickly. And so we created a structured design for these leaders and their staff sometimes to have access to renewal, which would look like a vacation, time off, rest and healing. And we normalized that. We really socialized that work. And it was really peculiar and strange for a lot of people. They felt guilty because they thought they should have been sticking with the work and doing the work. And we really have been developing a practice to allow folks to see that they can't do the work long term unless they're well themselves. And this is true for community philanthropy and for our staff as well. And so I really want to encourage us to think about, as we mount these strategies, as we deal with the long-term impact of COVID-19 and all of these lessons that we've learned across the breadth of disasters that all of us have seen in different parts of the nation, there's a real opportunity for us to put our oxygen mask on first, to consider community and really stay close to the folks who are closest to the challenge, and to keep equity top of mind so that our strategies are actually commensurate with the challenges ahead of us.
Thank you very much, Flozell, for that wisdom over, unfortunately, way too many disasters that you've had to sort of navigate and lead through. But thank you for that terrific set of recommendations and lessons. Tony, I turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be with you all. It's really a pleasure to be here with Flozell. Just as a little bit of background, I was, as Flozell mentioned, the foundation was created within 6 days after Hurricane Katrina. And I had worked at a community foundation. I'd been founding CEO of a private foundation and found myself in Baton Rouge helping create the foundation soon after Hurricane Katrina with a bunch of other philanthropic leaders and local leaders, putting our heads together to what a foundation might look like and what it might mean for both the relief and recovery in Louisiana and Mississippi and those areas that were affected. And it's been wonderful actually to watch the growth of the foundation and the continued leadership that Flozell and the foundation continue to provide to the state, both in times of crisis and times outside of crisis. And I've been honored and privileged to have played a small part in that. I think building on Flozell's remarks, a couple of things I would say. One thing that I would just open with, that it's paradoxical, but it's something that is almost a cliche, but it's true in that in the midst of crisis, especially a crisis of the scale and range that we're experiencing right now of COVID, there's also opens up this space for opportunity. And what I saw best in my experience, both in Louisiana and Mississippi immediately after Katrina, and then even working internationally and through USAID and helping develop the resilience policy that we did, was that those leaders that are as successful as possible and the institutions that are successful in crisis are the ones that actually take advantage of those opportunities, move quickly and entrepreneurially to do that. As Flozell mentioned, as we created the foundation post-Katrina, we were focused on equity, and it became a core and defining theme and a fundamental part of the DNA of the institution. One of the reasons for that was that we also recognized with some humility that despite the incredible outpouring of philanthropic support that the foundation was benefiting from, and donations from all over the US, and also fundraising that was happening from former presidents Bush and Clinton, and quite substantial, we're talking tens of millions of dollars, that it would pale in comparison actually to the public funds and the public resources that were going to be spent on recovery as well. And so ensuring that the policy making that would be made, both in the immediate and over the medium term, on how those resources would get allocated, ensuring that there was the voice of those groups that were most vulnerable or most affected by the crisis, had some influence on how those resources got spent and allocated, was actually really important. And I think also provided an opportunity for the philanthropic institutions, both the community foundations and the Foundation for Louisiana, and even and the nonprofit organizations, to really be part and participate in the conversations that were happening about the policy that was getting made on how those public funds would be spent. And you had a whole new institution come up, the Louisiana Recovery Authority, that was actually in charge of spending the recovery funds that came through FEMA and other places, the $20 to $30 billion and more that eventually came. And I think it's really important to be thinking about how, as an institution, you might be positioned as community foundations to be part of the conversations around public policy being made and who it affects and the scale to which it reaches. Because there's also opportunity for systems to be changed as well. And I think what really opened up conversations in New Orleans and other places on some very difficult issues prior to the storm, issues, for example, of public education and a low-performing public education system, issues of public housing and economic mobility, and issues of safety and violence around those public housing. All of those things, because of the crisis, actually took on an opportunity to change that conversation and to experiment and to be able to have a conversation around what kind of policy changes could be made. That was actually quite difficult and stuck, I think, before the crisis. And so to be thinking about that and what the opportunities are in your own local community, to be thinking about what sorts of conversations and systems, especially as they affect the most vulnerable or those communities that have been left behind prior to the crisis, I think is a real opportunity. For better or for worse, New Orleans went to sort of an all charter school system as an education system immediately following the hurricane, and Flozell will have a much better perspective on what that's meant. But I think my major point is there's the opportunity for actually changing the conversations and doing it quite significantly and quickly, and bringing interventions that you think might have a higher possibility for change. So I think being cognizant of those and acting quickly to take advantage of those opportunities is really a chance that COVID actually presents to us. Secondly is the the unusual types of partnerships that can be created out of crisis. And Flozell talked about the regional data center and the work that happened, the focus on data and the work that happened with the regional data center. That was actually, interestingly, a partnership with the Brookings institution that probably would not have happened prior to the hurricane. And Brookings being able to bring some of its competence and technical savvy on data to be able to work with the regional data center. And looking for those types of partnerships, I think, especially as they intersect with public institutions and government, is a real opportunity in a crisis like this. Data is also, I think, very difficult to come by, even if you want to be, do evidence-based decision making. And I think one of the things that we did immediately after Hurricane Katrina was to start investing in the local association of nonprofits to enable them to do assessments of the nonprofit community overall, what was happening, to what extent those nonprofits were being affected. Were they being able to access either recovery relief resources that were being made available through state and federal government, or from other philanthropic institutions? So having a handle on that and being able to get a sense of where the community actually really is, both at the community outcome level that Flozell talked about through the regional data center, as well as at the nonprofit level and the investments that were being made in the Louisiana Association of Nonprofits, to be able to stay up to date on that was really important, because I think it then directed both some of the local community foundations as well as the Foundation for Louisiana, gave them a sense of where the real needs were, also where technical assistance could be provided and education could be provided for how those nonprofits would be able to access the funds that they needed to be able to respond to the needs. And then I think the third thing I would say is that the opportunity for those unusual partnerships also presented itself in the need for surge capacity. So nonprofits needed surge capacity, especially if they were working on issues like that were associated with the relief, like housing and shelter and small businesses and things like that. The foundations themselves needed surge capacity, and governmental institutions also needed surge capacity, just didn't have the planning, for example, planning infrastructure that they might need in capacity. And so the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, created a partnership with the University of Pennsylvania to create the CUREX fellowships that then brought in fellows into local government to give them more capacity to do the type of planning and things they needed. And also funded a participatory planning process so that as the community recovered, it was something that was guided by both local residents as well as decision makers. You had a leadership program that Jim Joseph was leading at Duke, do an emerging leaders program. And it's interesting that I think there's an opportunity for that surge capacity to also come from and create a pipeline of future leaders. And Flozell touched on this a bit. He touched on it from an equity perspective, but I would also look at it from youth as well. This is an opportunity to bring a certain segment of the population into capacity and leadership positions that can be helpful to build their ongoing leadership and to get them to be part of the recovery that's to come. And that leadership continues on, and there's many instances in which those people continue to serve in their institutions. And I think just my final point before we get into Q&A and conversation, the planning process that I talked about was actually the third planning process. The first two planning processes that happened in New Orleans post-Katrina sort of blew up, had lots of great thinking put into them, had lots of expertise, and you know, people reached out and brought lots of good thinking together. But I think because they weren't involving people whose lives were actually going to be affected, and we're trying to move fairly quickly to be able to respond and get things moving again and get it, make you go as fast as you can to get things back to normal. I think it's important. There's a very tricky balance and a real tension between moving fast, moving quickly, having people feel as if there is progress being made toward reopening and recovery, at the same time as protecting process to ensure that voices and leadership and participation happens from communities and groups of people who are really going to be affected by those particular decisions. And I think both the Foundation for Louisiana and community foundations are really well positioned to play a role of being a broker of those particular tensions. And with your convening power, with the networks and relationships that you've built through donors and other stakeholders, and the neutral role you can play to be able to bring those conversations together, I think there's a real opportunity and a real role to play. And I can't leave off with just emphasizing what Flozell talked about mental health, and this will take up psychological space for a long time as people are doing their work, and being attentive to that and providing opportunities for people to deal with that as they're trying to rebuild and recovery is especially important. And the sabbatical program that he talked about was really instrumental, and I think thinking along those lines is really helpful and a great role for the Community Foundation.
Thank you, Tony. Those are really great insights from someone who was in that crisis from the beginning, but also a little bit removed, so you could really share what you were learning. So Tony and Flozell, I'll urge you to put your video back on. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. And if you're willing to, then also ask your question via audio. So we have a question from Tara Sandercock. Hi, Tara. If you're willing to ask your question, would you please put yourself on audio at least, and video if you're willing?
Yes, I will. Thank you both so much, or all of you really, for this wonderful program. My question was related to Tony and also Flozell.
Tara, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Tell us where you're from.
Sorry.
Tell everyone where you're from. Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm with the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro in North Carolina, and happy to be with everybody today. There's something special about the group of Community Foundation. My question is directed to colleague in North Carolina, Tony, but really to both of you. It's great to hear you just thinking about the first-time aspect to the process. And you described the first two processes kind of blowing up, and you pivoted to a more participatory process. Can you say more about how you did that? And hindsight is 2020, but this is a new 2020, and we need the benefit of that.
We're in 2020, right, Tara?
Exactly.
Should see clearly.
And we thought we'd have.
Well, Flozell, I don't know if you want to comment. You might want to start on this because you were involved in some of those conversations just directly as from your perch at Tulane, and also in the community itself. You might want to comment on, what was the failure of those first couple of planning processes?
It goes right to the point that Tony made. There was an emphasis on urgency. Everything was completely urgent. And, so folks fell back to their normal strategy of, let me get a room full of experts, right? Experts. And we're going to come up with some great ideas. It won't surprise you, Tara, that many of those ideas were populated by pre-existing ideas that were not great ideas before Katrina. If I'm really honest with you. And they were ideas that were created in spaces that minimized the ability for people closest to the challenge or the opportunity, as Tony put it, to really get in there and help inform what the opportunity was. And as it turns out, it's a really simple thing. When you take the time and use the resources to engage people and Tony can tell you some about the differences he saw. All of a sudden, you got a few things that mattered. You, one, got information that either confirmed what the data was telling folk and what they thought the analysis was, or you got really interesting and new data from people who were having experience and who were realizing how systems were either working for them or not, where ideas that had been made just 2 weeks ago that people thought were great ideas, in fact, were not operationally working for people. And you also then had a constituency behind the ideas. So it makes a huge difference in systems change in a disaster recovery context in particular, because new policies are being made, new practices are being designed,
Right.
new leaders are being put in place sometimes because of shakeups. You want to make sure you have a constituent that is supporting the great ideas. And so including people wasn't just the right thing to do. All of a sudden, decision makers understood, oh, the people who voted for them or likely to be looking for this because they were participating in the process. If you're a leader in the community context, right? People really wanted to show up for their neighbors. They wanted to show up for their business partners or their church members. And so having people engaged made a huge difference and looked very different than the prior two efforts, if you will.
I see that.
Yeah, just to add on to that a little bit. So like that third participatory planning process was very intentional about getting the voices of people who were affected. I mean, they went to, they had sessions, they actually went to Houston, they went to places that people had fled to. So they had focus groups and they had inputs and surveying of people, no matter where they were scattered, about what the city might look like as it came back.
Mm-hmm.
There is political leadership, and I don't mean with a big P, I don't mean always elected political leaders, but there is political leadership about the intent and about the reality of what you're trying to achieve through that recovery, as well as who is going to have be consulted and have some influence on that decision. That's a role for anyone. That's a role for a community institution or a leader of a community institution, not just the elected leaders. But to Flozell's point, I do think the elected leaders started to realize that their constituents were rebelling. I think the other thing that I guess I would say is, and I used to talk about this because I would, as Deborah mentioned, I would go in and out of the area. I was helping the foundation, but I wasn't living there on a regular basis. And I was also doing consulting in other parts of the country. And I would talk about New Orleans, actually, post-Katrina, as being one of the most civically active places in the United States, which I don't think we would have said was the case before the hurricane. And I do think that coming out of crisis and coming into an experience that everyone shares like this, you have a real appetite and opportunity because people are willing to be involved. They're interested, they're willing to put their time and effort into creating something that they feel like is better than what they were experiencing before. They see how the seams come apart when put under duress. And I think it's a real opportunity to take advantage of that. But it's important to take advantage of that with humility as well. But there's a real opportunity to engage people. People are interested and willing and wanting to be involved and wanting to be active.
And I think especially around equity.
Yeah, it was probably, Tara, the first time we had a chance to really interrogate an equity agenda using the scale of resources and the fact that all of these policy conversations were broken open in a way that we would not have been able to do pre-Katrina because there was just too much inertia. It would have been too difficult. We can count among the things that were developed that would never have happened. The day Katrina hit, we were the most incarcerated city in the world. We had 7,000 people in the local jail for a city that only had 480,000 people in it, right? It's a small city, an extraordinary incarceration rate. Today, because of efforts mounted through this policy work, through philanthropic investment, community leadership, in the disaster response context, mind you, we don't even register on the top 25 list of cities in the country. We have, in this moment, about 768 people in the local jail, which is a dramatic shift. A dramatic shift. And by the way, crime hasn't changed at all, which is one of the data sets that was asserted from the schools of public health, some of the community members and others in those moments that quite frankly weren't believed in the moment. But we've been able to prove that out. And I think there are other examples of that in this COVID-19 opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks to you both, and thanks for that great question, Tara, which elicited such a full response. Is there any other questions that you might want to put in the chat box? I'll ask what probably isn't a quick question, but I have a question for you, Flozell. In your reminder to put your oxygen mask on first.
Yeah.
I really am seeing community foundation leaders stepping up like never before, as you're seeing, but they're tired.
Yeah.
It's been a long time, and furthermore, we can't interact with each other. And that just adds that extra level of stress. Is there any tip that you can give that you are doing for your own staff? Is there anything that you're doing that others might be able to take on right now to give their staff a little bit of a breather and, as you say, some rest?
Yeah. One of the things we're doing, Deborah, and thank you for the question, is we're sort of rotating duties. And so it occurred to us very quickly, and because we already had a practice, we were looking for this, that the working from home actually creates a different level of stress and potential anxiety, because we don't get a chance to be in community with each other at work.
Right.
We forget how sometimes the water cooler, the kind of hallway interactions, being in meetings physically with each other, actually add to our well-being. We have a joke, who knew we would miss having meetings, right? At least with each other. And so we try to find a way to make sure, whether it's allowing people to take a 4-day week or creating space for people to create really flexible time management strategies, they float those through their supervisor. But I've normalized and socialized it such that now when we have staff meetings, I'm asking, who is taking time off? Who is resting? I don't see you really pushing your staff to take care of themselves. And so it's really shifted the dynamic. Quite frankly, before they were scared to ask for it. They were concerned about it making it look like they were not as hardworking and as sort of gung-ho and passionate. And a new development for us that I haven't seen before, because COVID-19 has just been, has ravaged the economy. My staff have been worried about their own jobs. And that's normally not something you see in philanthropy, right? Or they have concerns because their partner may have lost their job. And so they just want to just keep pressing through and working as hard as possible. And I know from experience, and I've had this myself, if you don't stand down with intention, you will be stood down, is what I tell them. And so we really do try to create, through our human resource practice, a way of normalizing that, making sure they have paid leave, even above and beyond what they may have, and if they needed, making sure that they're accessing other community assets that may be there, making sure they're taking advantage of their benefits. I'm sure every person on this call has staff who you get to the end of the year, they haven't taken their vacation time, they haven't taken other leave, they haven't done things to take care of themselves. We really are pushing on all those fronts.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have one last question here from Erica. If you're still on the webinar, do you want to ask your question about the point in the recovery when they started the LEAD program? Erica, if you're still on.
Sure. Thank you so much. This was really valuable information.
Please introduce yourself, Erica. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Erica from Fairfield County's Community Foundation in Connecticut. And I actually have recently joined the foundation probably about 7 months ago. So I've been doing a field scan on community capacity building programs across the country. And so I was just curious, because I am looking to capitalize on the moment and the crisis that COVID is allowing or unearthing in our communities. And I'm just wondering, how soon into the recovery process did you all at the Foundation for Louisiana start the LEAD program? I'm really intrigued by that, and just wondering if there's some things that I can think about as I create this outline and proposal for us to begin and launch a program that would give some community residents and leaders more refined skills, and also project-based and grant-making.
No, it's a perfect question. Thank you, Erica, for asking it. So we developed the LEAD initiative probably in 2011, which was quite a few years after the foundation was founded in 2005. But its predecessor was the Equity and Inclusion Campaign. So in the context of what you mentioned, there really was a learning opportunity for us out of the campaign, where we saw each of the tables. We had tables for each of the 5 areas that the members of the campaign were working on, and they would get to weigh in on the grant making process. And so we really learned a lot from that. We saw how it sharpened our decision making, it sharpened the likelihood that we would get outcomes from the grants that we were making. And so when we shifted our institutional strategy and shifted from the Disaster Recovery Foundation to Foundation for Louisiana, we wanted to draw that lesson on into the sort of next life. And that's when we created the LEAD initiative, which to be certain gave us a chance to, one, identify cohort members from across different sectors and in different parts of community. And 2, it allowed us to create the technical learning, the skills building, particularly around policy work. Just to be clear, we've always been interested in, and we focus that work on policy change as a way of getting at scale change. And so whether it was housing or cultural things or stuff around economic opportunity, you name it, we would bring in experts. We would bring in people who were in leadership positions so that they could build those relationships and broaden their networks and have a different kind of impact. And then they would decide on a strategy. And I'll give you a really quick example of this. And we would make grants to support that work. One group decided it wanted to support owner-occupied rehab, which was a critical issue in communities that have post-disaster concerns. And they realized the city of New Orleans didn't have a policy around affordable housing writ large. Tony, can you imagine that, even after all those years of Katrina? And so they didn't have a way of implementing this strategy. So they thought bigger. We helped them think, be outside of the box, and they decided to create something, Erica, called Housing NOLA, which was the first of its kind 10-year affordable housing strategy that would both interrogate creative financing models, because that was a part of what was missing from the equation, while also building a cohort of community members, thousands of people by the time they were done, who they'd met with and consulted with to develop a housing policy strategy. That work has now come out of the foundation and now is an independent and thriving nonprofit organization that's added to the landscape in a way that we've never seen with regard to housing issues in the greater New Orleans area. And that's an example of something that came out of LEAD. And when we created it in 2011, we were hoping it would do that. We didn't know it would turn out that way. So thank you for the question.
Well, I wish that we had more time. This has been really, really informative. As you can see by the chat box, people have been really thrilled by how meaningful and thoughtful your remarks are. So I'm going to turn this over to Len Bartel to close us out with a poem. But before we do that, as I'm reminded here, we will see you in 2 weeks. We are now going to every other week for these webinars, and we will be trying to focus on a theme somewhat like we had a little bit of a theme here today. If there are any particular topics you want us to focus on, please email Caroline Miranda at cmiranda@cfleads.org. Her email was on the original slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Len for our poem, and then Len, please close us out.
Yes, will do. Thank you so much. This is a very brief poem. It's by Adrienne Rich, called Natural Resources. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. So thank you again to Flozell and Tony for sharing their thoughts about rebuilding and reconstituting our world. And thank you all for continuing to join us. And again, we'll be back with you on the 21st. And thank you so much.